For the sixth consecutive year, nobody had bothered to include her in their holiday plans, so Margaret Wells decided to purchase a lakeside property entirely for herself. 7 days after closing, the entire family appeared at her doorstep with luggage and an unauthorized key, assuming she would be sitting alone in grateful anticipation of their company. What they could not have anticipated was that Margaret had invited a sheriff's deputy, installed comprehensive surveillance equipment, and retained legal counsel to witness their arrival. She would make certain they understood this intrusion marked the final instance of their presumptuous behavior. The revelation about their upcoming celebration was never intended to reach her ears. The carefully orchestrated exclusion required silence and discretion. However, when your 9-year-old grandson initiates a video conversation because he genuinely misses speaking with you, secrets tend to emerge despite everyone's best intentions. Noah's round face filled the tablet screen, his expression confused and slightly troubled as he settled into whatever chair he had claimed in his father's living room. His voice carried that particular quality of childhood honesty that adults spend years learning to suppress. "Nana Maggie, how come you're not coming to our house again this Christmas? Everyone keeps saying you're busy with other stuff." Margaret set down the book she'd been reading, her reading glasses sliding slightly down her nose as she leaned toward the device. The question landed in her chest like something cold and heavy. She kept her voice deliberately light, though her fingers had begun to tremble slightly against the tablet's edge. "What do you mean, sweetheart? Nobody's mentioned anything to me about Christmas plans yet. It's only the 2nd of December. Behind Noah's shoulder, Margaret could distinguish the familiar cream-colored wallpaper of her eldest son's home, already decorated with elaborate garlands and twinkling lights. Christine had always been zealous about seasonal decorating, starting earlier each year as if the premature festivity could somehow compensate for the emotional sterility of their household. Noah's forehead wrinkled in the particular way that reminded Margaret painfully of Richard before illness had stolen him away. "But Dad told Mum yesterday that you couldn't make it this year. He said you had your own plans. Mum's already making spreadsheets for who's bringing what food." She showed me on her computer. "There's this whole folder called Holiday Planning 2023 with everybody's assignments and everything." Margaret's throat tightened. "Did you happen to see my name anywhere in that folder, Noah?" Before the child could formulate a response, a manicured hand appeared in the frame and extracted the tablet from his grip. Christine's perfectly composed face replaced Noah's honest confusion. Not a single dark hair escaped from her sleek ponytail, and her makeup appeared freshly applied despite the late afternoon hour. "Noah, you know the rules about using electronics without permission." Christine's voice carried that particular edge of maternal disapproval that Margaret had always found slightly performative. Then Christine's eyes focused on the screen and registered Margaret's presence. "Oh, Margaret, I didn't realize he'd called you. He's been testing boundaries lately. The child psychologist says it's developmentally normal." Margaret straightened in her chair, determined to address the situation directly rather than allowing Christine to deflect with parenting jargon. "Christine, Noah mentioned something about Christmas plans. It sounds like you're hosting this year." Christine's smile contracted almost imperceptibly, the way skin tightens around a fresh wound. "We're still working out the details. Nothing's been finalized yet. You know how complicated it gets trying to coordinate everyone's schedules." "I see." Margaret held her expression carefully neutral, a skill she had refined across 63 years of navigating academic politics and family dynamics. "Well, whenever you do finalize those details, I'd appreciate being informed. I'd very much like to spend time with my grandchildren during the holidays." "Of course. We should probably go now. Noah has piano practice in 20 minutes. Christine's tone suggested the conversation had already exceeded her tolerance. "Say goodbye to Nana Maggie, Noah. Margaret heard Noah's muffled farewell before the connection terminated, leaving her staring at her own reflection in the darkened screen. She sat motionless for several long minutes, the silence of her house pressing against her from all directions. 6 years. Half a dozen Christmases since Richard's death. 6 years of increasingly transparent fabrications and progressively more elaborate excuses. We're keeping it intimate this year. Just immediate family. As if she had somehow ceased to qualify as family upon becoming a widow. The kids have all been exposed to something at school. We don't want to risk your health. As if her immune system had become fragile the moment she turned 60. Oh, didn't Robert mention it? We changed our plans at the last minute, as if her eldest son's consistent failure to communicate somehow absolved him of responsibility. Margaret looked around the house she had shared with Richard for 38 years, where they had raised 3 children and hosted countless gatherings, where laughter and arguments and life had once filled every room. Now the space felt more like an archive than a home, carefully preserved but fundamentally empty. Something inside her, some capacity for bending and accommodating that had sustained her through 6 years of loneliness, finally reached its breaking point. She opened her laptop and navigated to her banking portal, still startled occasionally by the substantial balance displayed there. Richard had possessed a genuine gift for financial planning, investing consistently throughout their marriage with an almost prescient understanding of market movements. Then there was the inheritance from her own family, which Richard had managed to grow substantially over the decades. Her children had no conception of her actual financial situation, primarily because Margaret and Richard had deliberately chosen modest living, prioritizing experiences and education over ostentatious displays of wealth. Robert, Jennifer, and Thomas assumed their mother survived on a teacher's pension and social security. They occasionally made comments suggesting she needed their financial assistance, which made their systematic exclusion even more galling. They neglected her, despite believing she struggled financially, not because of it. Margaret's cursor hovered over the real estate website she had been browsing intermittently for months. What had begun as idle fantasy, a way to imagine alternative futures during her loneliest evenings, suddenly crystallized into concrete intention. 3 hours later, she had scheduled a viewing for a property she had admired online for weeks. The listing described a contemporary lakeside home with floor-to-ceiling windows, expansive decks on multiple levels, and complete privacy on 7 wooded acres. The asking price was $1.4 million, a figure that would render her children absolutely speechless. The real estate agent, Patricia, seemed distinctly skeptical when Margaret arrived alone for the viewing the following afternoon. The woman's eyes traveled from Margaret's sensible leather boots to her unpretentious wool coat, clearly calculating whether this potential buyer possessed the financial resources the property demanded. "This is quite a significant investment," Patricia said carefully, her tone hovering between polite and condescending. "Most of our buyers in this price range are younger couples or families looking for vacation properties. The maintenance alone can be substantial." "I'm not most buyers," Margaret replied simply, refusing to elaborate or justify her presence. As Patricia guided her through the house, Margaret felt something settle in her chest that she had not experienced since Richard's death, a sense of rightness, of recognition. The soaring windows showcased the lake beyond, its surface rippling with late autumn wind. The massive stone fireplace dominated the living area, its river rock construction extending 2 stories to the cathedral ceiling. The gourmet kitchen featured commercial-grade appliances and enough counter space to finally attempt those elaborate recipes she had been collecting. The previous owners installed a comprehensive security system, Patricia mentioned as they toured the primary bedroom suite. State-of-the-art cameras, motion sensors, the complete package. You'd need to reactivate the monitoring subscription, But the infrastructure is already in place. Margaret nodded, already envisioning herself here, safe, independent, undisturbed by people who treated her presence as optional. "I'll take it," she announced. Patricia blinked several times in rapid succession. "Don't you want to think it over? Perhaps discuss it with family members. Get a home inspection." "I've been thinking it over for months," Margaret said, which was true in its way. "And my family isn't involved in my financial decisions. I'll pay cash if that expedites the process." 2 weeks later, Margaret signed the final documents and received the keys to her new home. Her cash offer had indeed accelerated the timeline considerably. As she drove up the winding road toward what was now her lakeside retreat, the first snowflakes of the season began drifting down, dusting the evergreens that lined the narrow driveway. Inside, she walked from room to room, running her hands along surfaces that belonged exclusively to her. No memories haunted these walls, no ghosts of disappointment or unmet expectations, no Richard, whose absence still created a hollow ache in her chest, but also no children, who had systematically relegated her to irrelevance. Margaret activated the security system immediately, downloading the monitoring application to her phone. The interface allowed her to view every camera feed from anywhere, a capability that brought surprising comfort. Then she called the one person who had remained consistently present through everything. "William, it's Margaret. I've done something that's either remarkably courageous or completely foolish, and I could use some legal advice about establishing residency and updating my estate documents." William Chambers had been Richard's closest friend since their undergraduate years and had become Margaret's most reliable support after Richard's death. As she explained her purchase and her motivations, his initial surprise transformed into wholehearted approval. "It's about damn time you did something entirely for yourself, Maggie," he said warmly, using the nickname only Richard and a few close friends had ever employed. "I'll drive up this weekend to help you get settled. We'll review all the documentation and make certain everything's properly organized." As she ended the call, Margaret stood at the wall of windows, watching snow accumulate on the lake's surface. For the first time in 6 years, she was actively looking forward to Christmas, a Christmas that would be entirely her own design. The first week in her lakeside house passed in a blur of deliveries and decisions. Margaret had brought only essential personal items from her previous home, choosing to furnish this new space completely from scratch. Each purchase felt like a declaration of independence. "This represents who I am now. This reflects what I actually enjoy." No more accommodating Richard's preference for heavy traditional furniture. No more maintaining her children's childhood bedrooms as shrines for visits that occurred with decreasing frequency. Every choice prioritized her comfort exclusively. The contemporary sectional sofa in charcoal grey, the adjustable bed with its massage functions and reading lights, the espresso machine she had always wanted but never purchased because Richard preferred simple drip coffee. "You're creating a cocoon," William observed Friday evening when he arrived with his overnight bag and a bottle of excellent champagne. His silver hair was damp from the light snow falling outside, and his familiar face creased with a smile that reached his eyes. "Building a nest. Is that what this is?" Margaret laughed, accepting the champagne. "I thought I was having some kind of delayed crisis." "A crisis involves destructive decision-making," he countered, gesturing around the open-concept living space with its breathtaking view of the snow-covered lake. "This is possibly the most constructive thing you've done in years." After showing William to the guest room, Margaret gave him a comprehensive tour, ending in the home office where she had installed the security system's monitoring station. Multiple screens displayed feeds from cameras positioned around the property's perimeter and at each entrance point. "Quite the command center," William remarked, raising an eyebrow. "Are you anticipating some kind of siege?" Just being practical, Margaret replied, though she did not mention the nagging worry that her children might not respect her boundaries once they discovered her new residence. I'm a woman living alone in a fairly isolated location. The security provides peace of mind. Over dinner, a bouillabaisse that Margaret had always wanted to attempt but never had because Thomas claimed to despise seafood, William helped her work through the practicalities of her new life. They discussed updating her will, changing her official residence, and notifying relevant institutions of her address change. "What about the old house?" William asked, refilling their wine glasses as they moved to the living room. "I'm considering selling it," Margaret admitted, settling into the corner of the sofa. "There's nothing keeping me there anymore." Just memories that feel heavier than comforting. A flash of concern crossed William's face. "Have you informed your children about any of this?" "The house, the move, your plans." "Not yet." Margaret traced the rim of her glass, avoiding his direct gaze. "They haven't called. Not even to discuss Christmas plans that apparently don't include me." William's expression darkened. He had witnessed Margaret's increasing isolation over the past 6 years, had seen how her children's visits became shorter and less frequent, how they forgot to include her in family gatherings, while simultaneously making comments about her supposedly limited finances and suggesting senior living facilities. "They've inherited their father's worst qualities," William said quietly. "Richard could be controlling and status-conscious. You balance those tendencies during the marriage, but without your influence, those traits have flourished unchecked in your children." "I keep asking myself where I failed," Margaret confessed, the wine loosening her usual reserve. "Was I too permissive, too critical? Did I fail to teach them empathy?" "You didn't fail, Maggie. Some people make selfish choices despite being raised with better values." William reached across to squeeze her hand. "The question now is, what do you want your relationship with them to look like going forward?" Margaret considered this as they sat by the fireplace, snow falling gently beyond the windows, the lake invisible now in the darkness. "I want relationships based on mutual respect, not obligation, not pity, and certainly not convenience when it suits them." William nodded thoughtfully. "Then perhaps this," he gestured around the room, "is the perfect catalyst for resetting those expectations." The following morning brought heavier snow and an unexpected visitor. Margaret was arranging newly delivered books on the built-in shelves when the security system chimed, alerting her to movement at the front entrance. On the monitor, she observed a man in his mid-40s wearing a heavy jacket and a knit cap with a sheriff's department logo. He carried what appeared to be a basket and was looking directly at the doorbell camera. "Good morning," he said, his voice coming through the system's intercom. "I'm David Morrison, your neighbor from down the road. Thought I'd welcome you to the lake community." Margaret hesitated only briefly before using the intercom to respond. "That's very thoughtful. I'll be right there." David Morrison stood considerably taller than Margaret's 5'6" frame, with broad shoulders and a face weathered by outdoor living. Despite his imposing physical presence, his smile conveyed genuine warmth as he handed her the basket. "Homemade sourdough, local honey, and a decent bottle of bourbon," he explained. "Lake Living Essentials." "That's incredibly kind. Would you like to come in for coffee? I just made a fresh pot." Over steaming mugs at her kitchen island, Margaret learned that David worked as a sheriff's deputy and was currently on medical leave while recovering from a shoulder injury sustained in the line of duty. He lived year-round in a cabin approximately half a mile down the lake road. "Not many full-time residents up here," he noted, glancing appreciatively around the house. "Most properties are weekend retreats for city people who rarely bother introducing themselves to anyone." "I'm planning to live here permanently," Margaret explained, surprised by how natural those words felt. "I recently retired from teaching at the university." "On your own?" David asked, then immediately backtracked. I apologize. That's none of my business. It's fine. Yes, I'm on my own. My husband passed away 6 years ago, and my children have their own lives. The simplified version of a far more complicated reality. David nodded, seeming to understand what she was not saying. Well, lake neighbors look out for each other. I'm just down the road if you ever need anything. He scribbled his number on a notepad on her counter. Cell service can be unreliable during heavy storms, but I've got a landline that never fails, and I'm usually home these days while this shoulder heals. After he left, Margaret stood at the window watching him navigate the snowy path back to the road, his movements careful around the injured shoulder. Something reassuring settled in her knowing someone was nearby, someone who had chosen this same solitude but remained open to connection. That evening, as William prepared to return to the city, he noticed David's number on the counter. "Making friends already?" he asked with a smile. "Just getting to know the neighbors," Margaret replied. "David says there aren't many year-round residents." "David, is it?" William's eyebrows rose teasingly. "Should I be jealous that you've replaced me as your primary emergency contact so quickly?" Margaret laughed and swatted his arm. "Don't be absurd. He's young enough to be my son, and considerably more attentive than your actual son," William observed pointedly. As they embraced goodbye at the door, William held her longer than usual. "I'm proud of you, Maggie. This is your second act. Make it everything you want it to be." Watching his taillights disappear down the snowy road, Margaret felt a curious lightness in her chest. For the first time in decades, her life belonged entirely to her, to shape as she wished. 2 weeks passed in peaceful solitude. Margaret established routines that pleased nobody but herself. Morning yoga facing the lake, afternoons reading by the fireplace or experimenting with watercolor painting, which she had always wanted to try. Evenings attempting complex recipes she had been collecting for years. She spoke with William every few days and exchanged friendly waves with David when their paths crossed on the private road they shared. She had almost forgotten about Christmas until her phone rang on December 19th. Robert's name appeared on the screen, her first contact from any of her children since moving to the lake. "Mom," he said when she answered, his voice carrying that familiar note of forced patience that had always irritated her. "Where have you been? I've tried calling the house 3 times this week." "Hello, Robert. I've been at home." "No, you haven't. I drove past yesterday afternoon and the house was completely dark. Your car wasn't in the driveway, so he had been checking on her, not out of concern for her well-being, Margaret suspected, but to confirm she would be alone for Christmas again, thereby reducing whatever minimal guilt they might feel about excluding her. "I've moved," Margaret said simply, her tone neutral. A beat of silence. "Moved? Moved where? You didn't say anything about moving." "I wasn't aware I required permission." The words emerged sharper than she had intended, years of suppressed hurt finding their voice. "Of course you don't need permission," Robert backpedaled quickly. "It's just surprising. This seems very sudden. Where are you living now? Some kind of senior community?" The assumption stung, as he had undoubtedly intended. "No, Robert. I've purchased a house at the lake." "You've what?" His shock would have been amusing under different circumstances. "Mom, how could you possibly afford something like that? Your pension can't—" "Your father and I were always prudent with our finances," Margaret interrupted, deliberately vague. "I'm quite comfortable, thank you." "But lakefront property?" The property taxes alone, and the isolation. Robert seemed to be processing aloud, recalibrating his understanding of her financial situation in real time. "You'll be so far from everything. I'm perfectly content with my decision." "Now, was there a specific reason you were calling?" Another pause. This one weighted differently. "Actually, yes. We've been trying to coordinate Christmas plans. Jennifer and Thomas are bringing their families to our house for Christmas Eve. Then we're all thinking of taking a little trip somewhere with snow for the kids. The perfect opening. Yet he still was not inviting her. 6 years of exclusion had made it habitual, automatic. "That sounds lovely," Margaret said evenly. "I hope you all enjoy yourselves." "Right. Well," Robert cleared his throat, "you'll be all right on your own for the holidays?" "I'm planning my own Christmas this year," Margaret said truthfully. "Something special." After ending the call, Margaret sat watching snowflakes dance outside the windows, an uneasiness settling over her. The conversation felt like reconnaissance, Robert confirming she had no expectations of inclusion before finalizing plans that explicitly excluded her. Her suspicions were confirmed 2 days later, when the security system alerted her to a vehicle approaching. Through the kitchen window, Margaret recognized Robert's luxury SUV creeping up her driveway, moving slowly as if the driver was uncertain about the destination. The vehicle stopped. Robert emerged, looking up at the house with an expression of obvious disbelief. He stood there for perhaps 2 minutes, taking in the architecture, the location, the clear evidence of substantial investment. Then he retrieved his phone and snapped several photographs before returning to his car and driving away. He never approached the door, never knocked, just photographed her home like it was some kind of tourist attraction and left. Margaret called William immediately. "He didn't even knock," she explained, watching Robert's car disappear down the lake road on the security feed. "Just took pictures and drove away." "That's concerning," William said, his lawyer's caution evident. "How did he even find your address?" "I checked, and the property records haven't been updated yet. I'm not sure. Could he have followed me on one of my trips into town? Possibly. Or perhaps the real estate agent mentioned something inappropriately." William paused. "Keep monitoring your security system closely, and let me know if anything else happens." That evening, Margaret double-checked every door and window before bed, that uneasiness growing into something closer to genuine concern. The next morning brought a flurry of text messages from all 3 of her children, more communication than she had received from them in months combined. From Robert: "Mom, we need to talk about this house situation immediately. Call me as soon as possible." From Jennifer: "Since when do you have money for a vacation home? This needs to be discussed as a family." From Thomas: "Are you sure this purchase makes sense at your age? Living alone at the lake seems risky." Margaret responded to none of them. Instead, she drove into town for groceries and final Christmas preparations, having decided to host a small dinner on Christmas Eve. Just herself, William, and David, who had mentioned having no family in the area. When she returned home that afternoon, arms full of packages and groceries, something felt immediately wrong. The security system showed no alerts, but some subtle difference in the entryway caught her attention. The decorative bowl on the console table had been moved slightly. One of her coats hung on a different hook than where she had left it. Margaret set down her bags carefully and checked the security application on her phone, reviewing footage from the past few hours with growing disbelief. At 2:43 in the afternoon, Jennifer's crossover SUV had pulled into her driveway. The exterior camera captured Jennifer and Thomas approaching her front door furtively, looking around before Jennifer reached into her purse and withdrew what was unmistakably a key. Margaret's heart began racing as she watched them let themselves into her home, without permission, without invitation. The interior cameras showed them wandering through every room, opening closets, examining furniture, peering at price tags she had not yet removed from some items. Their commentary was captured clearly by the audio system. "This place must have cost at least $1.5 million, Jennifer said, running her hand along the kitchen's quartz countertop. Where in hell did she get this kind of money? Dad must have had investments none of us knew about, Thomas replied, opening her refrigerator and helping himself to a bottle of sparkling water without hesitation. She definitely couldn't afford this on a teacher's pension. Did you see the view? This location is prime real estate, Jennifer continued, moving to the windows. Think about the family gatherings we could host here. So much more impressive than her old house. Robert's already making plans. We're all coming up for Christmas. Surprise her, he says. Thomas laughed, as if this is somehow still her decision to make. Margaret's hands trembled as she fast-forwarded through their 43-minute invasion of her privacy. Before leaving, Jennifer placed something on the kitchen counter, a key which she pointed to while saying something to Thomas about making certain everyone had access. Margaret checked her front door. Locked. Meaning they had relocked it when leaving. If she had not reviewed the security footage, she might never have known about their intrusion. Fighting rising panic, Margaret called William, then David. Within 30 minutes, both men arrived. David came directly from his shift, still in his sheriff's deputy uniform. They had a key, Margaret said, her voice steadier than she felt as she showed them the footage. Jennifer used a key to enter my house without permission. The only way they could have obtained that key is if someone from the real estate transaction provided it inappropriately. Which would be highly unethical at minimum, William said grimly, and possibly criminal depending on the circumstances. David studied the security footage with professional focus. This is textbook criminal trespass, he confirmed. Having a key doesn't grant legal authority to enter someone's home without consent. That key was presumably for the previous owners or for property showings before purchase. Margaret took a deep breath, steadying herself against the kitchen island. They're planning to come here for Christmas. All of them. Robert apparently told the others they're going to surprise me. Do you want to change the locks? David asked practically. I want them to understand they cannot invade my life whenever it suits them, Margaret replied, a lifetime of accommodating suddenly giving way to righteous anger. I want them to face consequences for their behavior. William and David exchanged a look she could not quite interpret. What did you have in mind? William asked carefully. They're expecting to arrive and waltz into what they clearly consider community property, Margaret said, thinking aloud. They're expecting me to be alone, probably waiting by the window like some pathetic figure hoping for company. Instead, I want them to encounter boundaries, consequences, reality. David nodded slowly. I can be here in uniform when they arrive. That alone will communicate that this isn't a casual family visit. And I'll be here as your legal counsel, William added. We'll have documentation of the trespass ready. Make it absolutely clear that entering your property without permission has legal implications. Margaret felt something crystallize inside her, a determination she had not accessed in years. Let's do it. Let's show them I'm not the helpless widow they can ignore and exploit at their convenience. That evening, Noah called again, his face filling the tablet screen with innocent excitement. Nana Maggie! Guess what? We're coming to see your new house for Christmas. Mom says it's at the lake and has lots of bedrooms for everyone. Dad says it's the perfect place for our family Christmas traditions. He's bringing his special eggnog that grown-ups drink. Aunt Jennifer is already planning where to put the Christmas tree. Uncle Thomas says there's probably a hot tub. Each word was a fresh revelation of their presumption. They were not just planning to visit, they were appropriating her home entirely, planning to impose their traditions in her space, without a single consideration for her wishes or consent. After ending the call with Noah, Margaret sat in stunned silence for several minutes. The completeness of their entitlement was breathtaking. They had not just excluded her from their Christmas plans for 6 years. They now intended to commandeer her private retreat for their own convenience. as if her purchase of the property had somehow been made on their behalf. That evening, when David stopped by to install additional motion sensors in areas the existing system had not covered comprehensively, Margaret shared what she had learned from Noah. "They're planning to stay for 3 days," she explained, unable to keep the disbelief from her voice. "They've already decided where to put their tree, which rooms they'll occupy, everything. Not a single one of them has actually asked if they're welcome here." David's expression darkened as he worked on mounting a new camera with a better angle of the driveway. "This goes beyond presumptuous. They're treating your home as communal property." "Exactly," Margaret agreed, handing him the mounting bracket he had asked for, "which means our Christmas Eve reception needs to be absolutely unambiguous. This is my home, my life, my choice about who enters and who does not." "Are you prepared for the potential fallout?" David asked gently, pausing his work to look at her directly. Family confrontations around holidays can leave lasting damage. Margaret gazed out at the snow-covered lake, its frozen surface gleaming in the moonlight. "The damage has already been done, David. For 6 years, they've shown me exactly where I stand in their lives. All I'm doing now is showing them where they stand in mine." Christmas Eve morning dawned clear and bitterly cold, sunlight glittering across pristine snow like scattered diamonds. Margaret woke early, a mixture of determination and nervous energy propelling her through her morning routine. Today everything would change, marking either the beginning of honest relationships with her children or the final acknowledgement that those relationships had been irreparably damaged by years of neglect and entitlement. She had spent the previous day transforming the house into exactly the Christmas environment she desired. No concessions to her children's preferences or expectations, no accommodations for grandchildren she rarely saw. Instead, she decorated with elegant restraint, white lights woven through fresh evergreen garlands on the mantelpiece, a small, tasteful tree adorned with the antique glass ornaments her mother had left her, sophisticated table settings for 3, herself, William and David, for Christmas Eve dinner. The guest rooms remained conspicuously untouched. No fresh towels, no turned-down beds, no welcome baskets or special preparations for unexpected visitors. Every aspect of the house made one clear statement: this is my home, arranged for my pleasure and my guests, not a hotel awaiting your unannounced arrival. At 9 o'clock, William called to confirm his plans. "I'll arrive around 2. He said. "That gives us plenty of time to review everything before your children's expected arrival." "Perfect. David is coming at 1 to help with final preparations." "How are you feeling, Maggie?" William's voice softened with concern. Margaret considered the question, looking out at the pristine landscape, the lake's frozen expanse extending toward distant mountains. "Remarkably calm," she replied truthfully. "For the first time in years, I feel completely in control of my own life and circumstances." After ending the call, Margaret checked her appearance in the full-length mirror. She had chosen her outfit with deliberate care. Not the comfortable but shapeless clothes her children had grown accustomed to seeing her in, but a well-tailored burgundy dress that flattered her still trim figure, paired with the pearl necklace Richard had given her on their 30th anniversary. Her silver hair was freshly styled in a modern cut that framed her face elegantly, and she had taken extra care with her makeup, emphasizing her eyes. The woman looking back at her did not resemble anyone's fading grandmother. She looked confident, sophisticated, and very much in command of her circumstances. David arrived precisely at 1 o'clock, dressed in his full sheriff's deputy uniform rather than the casual clothes Margaret had grown accustomed to seeing him in. The official appearance was intentional. They had agreed his presence should communicate authority rather than merely friendship. "The roads are clear," he reported, stamping snow from his boots in the entryway. "No weather issues that might delay their arrival." "Good." Everything needs to proceed according to our timeline, not theirs. They spent the next hour reviewing the security system footage, capabilities, and finalizing their strategy. David had positioned the additional cameras to capture the driveway approach and every entrance to the house from multiple angles. All feeds were now displayed on multiple devices: the monitoring station in her office, David's tablet, and Margaret's phone, ensuring they would have comprehensive awareness of her family's arrival and movements. "Remember," David said as they finished the preparations, "you're in complete control here. This is your house, your rules, your boundaries. Don't let them flip the script or make you feel guilty." "I won't," Margaret promised, grateful for his steady presence. When William arrived at 2 o'clock, bringing a bottle of expensive champagne for celebrating afterward, the three of them conducted a final walkthrough of the house. Every detail was perfect, from the elegant holiday decorations to the tantalizing aroma of the beef Wellington slowly cooking in the oven, a sophisticated Christmas Eve dinner for three. "The table settings are a particularly effective touch," William observed, nodding at the dining room with its three carefully arranged place settings, the fine china and crystal gleaming in the afternoon light. "The physical evidence that you weren't expecting them speaks volumes." "That's precisely the point," Margaret agreed. "I've moved forward, created my own traditions. They need to understand I'm no longer waiting by the phone, hoping for their attention." At 3:45, David's tablet chimed with an alert. "Vehicle approaching," he announced, showing them the feed from the driveway camera. Robert's luxury SUV led the procession, followed by Jennifer's crossover and Thomas's sports sedan. Margaret counted heads as they parked in her driveway, all three of her children, their spouses, and 6 grandchildren, ranging from Noah's 9 years to Jennifer's daughter Sophie's 15th. 11 people arriving unannounced, expecting accommodations in a house prepared for 3. "Are you ready?" William asked quietly, standing beside her at the window as they watched the group unload luggage and wrapped gifts. "Completely," Margaret assured him, though her heart had begun to race with adrenaline. David positioned himself in the kitchen doorway, visible from the entrance, but not immediately confrontational. They watched on the monitor as Jennifer approached the front door, key in hand, confidence evident in her posture. Her first attempt to insert the key failed, so did her second attempt. Confusion crossed her face as she realized the locks had been changed. After a brief consultation with Christine, Robert's wife, Jennifer pressed the doorbell instead. The chime echoed through the house as Margaret smoothed her dress, took a deep breath, and moved to answer it with deliberate, unhurried steps. "Surprise!" Multiple voices chorused as Margaret opened the door, their faces arranged in expressions of exaggerated excitement that faltered slightly when they registered her appearance, elegant, composed, and clearly not surprised at all. "Hello," Margaret said pleasantly, making no move to step aside and allow entrance. "This is unexpected." Robert recovered first, his salesman's smile sliding back into place with practiced ease. "Merry Christmas, Mom! We thought we'd surprise you with a family holiday at your new place." He gestured expansively at the assembled group behind him. "Everyone's here, the whole family together." "So I see," Margaret replied, still blocking the doorway. "How thoughtful of you to decide how I should spend Christmas in my own home, without bothering to ask." An uncomfortable silence descended as her less than enthusiastic response registered. Christine shifted awkwardly beside Robert. Jennifer's husband checked his watch impatiently. The younger grandchildren looked confused by the palpable tension. "Mom," Jennifer said with a nervous laugh, her breath creating small clouds in the cold air, "it's freezing out here. Can we please come inside?" "That depends," Margaret said calmly. "Did any of you consider calling to ask if I was available to host 11 people for Christmas, or whether I had made my own plans?" Thomas stepped forward, employing the cajoling tone he used when he thought she was being unreasonable. "Come on, Mom. We wanted to surprise you. You're always saying you want to see more of the grandkids. We thought you'd be thrilled." "A surprise visit is dropping by for coffee, Thomas, not arriving with enough luggage for a 3-day stay without invitation or advance notice." Robert's expression darkened, his forced joviality evaporating. "Mom, you're being ridiculous. It's Christmas. Family should be together." "I agree completely," Margaret said, "which is why it's so interesting that this is the first Christmas in 6 years that any of you have wanted to include me in your plans, coincidentally, right after I purchased a desirable lakefront property." The stunned silence that followed was broken by Noah's innocent voice. "Daddy, you said Nana Maggie would be so happy to see us." The genuine confusion in his voice nearly broke Margaret's resolve, but she reminded herself this was not about punishing her grandchildren. It was about establishing boundaries their parents had trampled for years. "I am always happy to see you, Noah," Margaret said gently, making eye contact with her grandson. "But right now I need to speak with your parents about some adult matters. Why don't you all come inside where it's warm and we'll sort this out?" She stepped aside finally, allowing them to enter the foyer, where they immediately noticed David standing in his sheriff's deputy uniform, watching silently from the kitchen doorway, his expression professionally neutral, but his presence unmistakable. Robert froze mid-step, his confident stride faltering. "Mom, why is there a sheriff's deputy in your house?" "This is Deputy David Morrison," Margaret said, closing the front door behind her bewildered family. "He's here because I have concerns about unauthorized entry into my home." "Unauthorized entry?" Jennifer's voice rose in confusion and alarm. "What are you talking about?" "Perhaps we should all move to the living room," Margaret suggested calmly. "Children, there's hot chocolate and cookies in the kitchen if you'd like some." Christine hesitantly began shepherding the younger grandchildren toward the kitchen, but 15-year-old Sophie and 13-year-old Jacob remained, clearly intrigued by the unfolding adult drama, sensing something significant was happening. William stepped forward from where he had been observing in the living room, his presence adding another layer of formality to the situation. "I'm William Chambers," he introduced himself with professional courtesy. "Mrs. Wells's attorney." "Attorney?" Robert's face flushed, genuine alarm replacing his earlier irritation. "Mum, what the hell is going on?" Margaret gestured toward the seating area, the contemporary sofas arranged around the stone fireplace. "Please, sit down. We have matters to discuss before we determine whether this surprise visit of yours can proceed." They complied reluctantly, exchanging alarmed glances as they arranged themselves on the sofas facing the fireplace, their earlier confidence completely evaporated. Margaret remained standing, a deliberate choice to maintain the position of authority in her own home. "2 days ago," Margaret began, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "Jennifer and Thomas entered this house without my knowledge or permission, using a key that Robert obtained through deception." "That's ridiculous," Thomas protested immediately, his face reddening. "We were just checking out the place," Jennifer interjected quickly, shooting Thomas a warning glance. "We were excited about your new home, Mom." "Curious. So excited that you didn't bother to call first or knock or wait for an invitation." Margaret gestured toward the large monitor on the wall, which William had cued with the security footage. "Perhaps this will refresh your memory." The screen came to life, showing Jennifer and Thomas furtively approaching her front door, looking around nervously before Jennifer used the key. Their recorded voices filled the room as they wandered through her house uninvited, opening closets, examining furniture, discussing which bedrooms they would claim for their families, and speculating about her finances. "Robert's already making plans. We're all coming up for Christmas. Surprise her," he says. Jennifer's recorded voice echoed through the suddenly silent room. Her recorded laughter followed, as if this is somehow still her decision to make. Margaret paused the footage, observing their reactions in the heavy silence that followed. Jennifer's face had drained of color. Thomas stared at his shoes, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Robert looked thunderstruck, perhaps realizing his siblings had just implicated him directly in their scheme. That's an invasion of privacy, Jennifer finally sputtered, grasping for any defense. You can't just record people without their knowledge. That's probably illegal. Actually, David spoke for the first time, his official tone filling the room with authority. Homeowners have the absolute legal right to maintain security systems on their property, including video and audio surveillance. What they don't have a right to do is enter someone else's home without permission, which constitutes criminal trespass under state law. We had a key, Thomas protested weakly. Obtained through false pretenses, William countered smoothly, stepping forward with documentation. Robert contacted the real estate office, claiming Mrs. Wells needed assistance due to mobility issues, a complete fabrication designed to gain unauthorized access to her property. I have the phone records and witness statements. All eyes turned to Robert, whose salesman's composure had completely evaporated, replaced by something closer to panic. I was just trying to help, he said weakly. We wanted to see the place before Christmas, to plan the gathering properly. You could have asked, Margaret said simply, her words landing like stones in still water. You could have called and said, Mum, we'd love to see your new home. May we visit? Instead, you chose deception, invasion, and presumption. Presumption? Christine had returned from settling the younger children in the kitchen, her face flushed with indignation. We're family. Family doesn't need formal invitations to visit. Apparently I do, Margaret replied, meeting her daughter-in-law's gaze steadily. For 6 years, I've needed an invitation to Christmas gatherings that never came. 6 years of, we're keeping it small this year, and we've made other plans. 6 years of seeing my grandchildren only when it was convenient for you. But now that I have something you want, this house, this location, suddenly I'm worthy of inclusion in the family Christmas. A heavy silence settled over the room, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Sophie, old enough to understand the implications of what was being said, looked between her parents and her grandmother with dawning comprehension and something that might have been shame. You never invited Grandma for Christmas? Sophie asked her mother, her voice carrying accusation. Not once, in 6 years. Jennifer shifted uncomfortably on the sofa. It's complicated, honey. You don't understand all the factors involved. It's actually quite simple, Margaret corrected gently but firmly. I became inconvenient after your grandfather died. Too much effort to include, too old-fashioned for your modern celebrations, too unnecessary. Until I acquired something desirable, this house, this location, and suddenly I'm worthy of being included in the family Christmas celebration. That's not fair, Robert protested, though his voice lacked conviction, the weakness of his objection evident even to himself. Isn't it? Margaret's voice remained calm, but steel underlay her words. Then explain why you told Noah I was busy this Christmas when you hadn't bothered to ask if I had plans. Explain why you felt entitled to enter my home without permission. Explain why you brought luggage for a 3-day stay without once considering whether I might want 11 unexpected houseguests. Explain why this is the first Christmas in 6 years that you've wanted me at your celebration. No one seemed able to formulate a response. David shifted slightly where he stood, his uniform catching the afternoon light, a reminder of the potential legal consequences hovering over the situation. Are we? Thomas finally ventured, his voice barely above a whisper. Are we being charged with something? That depends on you, Margaret answered, her gaze moving across each of her children in turn. I have no desire to press criminal charges against my own children. What I want is acknowledgement, respect, and genuine connection, not to be treated as an afterthought or a convenience to be accessed when it suits you. William stepped forward, holding a document folder. Mrs. Wells has prepared a simple statement of understanding. It acknowledges the unauthorized entry, establishes clear expectations about future visits requiring explicit invitation, and outlines a path forward for rebuilding family relationships based on mutual respect rather than presumption and entitlement. You want us to sign a contract to visit our own mother? Jennifer asked incredulously, her voice rising with disbelief. No, Margaret corrected her firmly. I want you to recognize that I am a person with autonomy, boundaries, and feelings, not a resource to be accessed when convenient and ignored when not. The document is merely a formal acknowledgement of that reality, a reset of expectations. The silence that followed was broken by an unexpected voice. Sophie, her teenage granddaughter, stood up from where she had been sitting beside her mother, her expression determined. I'll sign it, Sophie said firmly, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. Grandma deserves better than how we've all treated her. The simple statement from a 15-year-old cut through the defensive posturing like a knife through butter. Jennifer looked at her daughter in surprise, then slowly back at Margaret, perhaps really seeing her for the first time in years, seeing past her own assumptions and convenience to the actual person standing before her. Mom, Jennifer began, her carefully maintained facade cracking slightly, emotion breaking through. We never meant to make you feel excluded or devalued. Intentions matter considerably less than actions, Margaret replied. Not unkindly, but with absolute firmness. For 6 years, your actions have spoken clearly about my place in your lives. All I'm doing now is showing you where you stand in mine. Robert, ever the pragmatist, assessed the situation with the calculated clarity of someone who recognized a negotiation was occurring. So where does this leave us right now? Are we supposed to just turn around and leave on Christmas Eve? Margaret looked around at her children, their spouses who had enabled or ignored their behavior, her grandchildren who were innocent parties in this adult conflict. She thought of the carefully prepared dinner for 3 in her dining room, the plans she had made for a quiet, dignified holiday on her own terms, free from the obligation and disappointment that had characterized the past 6 years. That, Margaret said finally, her voice carrying absolute authority, depends entirely on what happens in the next few minutes, on whether you can acknowledge what you've done and commit to genuine change. For several long moments no one spoke. The crackling fire and distant sounds of the younger children in the kitchen were the only noises breaking the tense silence. Margaret remained standing, watching her 3 adult children process the reality of their situation, caught in deception, confronted with evidence, and finally facing consequences for years of thoughtless, entitled behavior. Robert was the first to recover, his businessman's instinct for damage control asserting itself. Mom, clearly we've made some serious mistakes here, he began, his tone shifting toward conciliation. We should have called first, obviously. We should have asked. The key situation was inappropriate. More than inappropriate, it was wrong. Inappropriate? Margaret repeated the word, letting its inadequacy hang in the air between them. Breaking into my home, planning to commandeer it for your holiday convenience without my knowledge or consent, treating my property as if it exists for your benefit. That goes considerably beyond inappropriate, Robert. Jennifer wiped at her eyes, her carefully applied makeup beginning to smudge. We never thought of it as breaking in, she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. In our minds, you'd be happy to have us all together. We convinced ourselves we were doing something nice for you. Without asking me, Margaret emphasized, without considering that I might have made my own plans after 6 years of solitary holidays, without once thinking that perhaps I deserved the courtesy of an invitation rather than an invasion. Thomas, always the most defensive of her children, shifted restlessly on the sofa. You're making it sound like we deliberately excluded you all these years. That's not entirely fair. We've all been busy. Lives get complicated with work and kids and... Too busy for a phone call? Margaret interrupted, her voice sharp. Too complicated to extend a simple invitation? Too occupied to include your mother in family celebrations? I never expected any of you to prioritize me above your own immediate families, Thomas. I just wanted to be considered part of those families instead of treated as an optional addition to be included only when convenient. Sophie stood up suddenly, her teenage face flushed with emotion. I want to know why we never visited Grandma for Christmas, she announced, looking directly at her mother with an accusatory expression. You always told me she preferred quiet holidays, that she didn't like the chaos of big family gatherings, that traveling in winter was difficult for her. Were those all lies? Jennifer flinched visibly, caught in the deception. Sophie, please. This isn't the appropriate time. It's exactly the appropriate time, Margaret countered firmly. Sophie deserves honest answers. All the grandchildren do. They deserve to understand why their grandmother was systematically excluded from family celebrations, why they were prevented from knowing her. Margaret turned to address her granddaughter directly, her heart aching at how much Sophie had grown during the years of enforced distance. I never said I preferred quiet holidays, Sophie. Quite the contrary. I called every December for 6 years, asking about Christmas plans, hoping for an invitation that never came. Christine cleared her throat, her expression defensive. In all fairness, Margaret, you don't exactly fit with our usual celebrations anymore. The children have certain expectations for Christmas, traditions we've established as individual families. Including you would have disrupted those dynamics. Traditions that deliberately excluded their grandmother, Margaret finished for her coldly. How remarkably convenient to establish traditions that justified leaving me out, that allowed you to celebrate without the inconvenience of including your husband's widowed mother. David shifted slightly from his position near the doorway, a subtle reminder of his official presence. Perhaps, he suggested professionally, this would be an appropriate moment to consider the agreement Mr. Chambers mentioned. It might provide a framework for moving forward constructively. William stepped forward with the documents, his expression professionally neutral, but his eyes showing warm support for Margaret. This isn't legally binding in a traditional contractual sense, he explained, handing the papers to Robert. Rather, it's a clear articulation of boundaries and expectations going forward. A reset of the relationship dynamic, if you will. Robert accepted the papers, scanning them with a deepening frown. This feels excessive. We're family. We shouldn't need written agreements about visiting and respecting boundaries. Apparently we do, Margaret replied evenly, her voice carrying no heat but absolute firmness. Because verbal understandings and basic human respect haven't been sufficient. Because for 6 years you've demonstrated that without explicit boundaries, you'll continue to treat me as optional when convenient and intrusive when it suits your purposes. As Robert read through the document, Noah appeared in the doorway, his small face troubled by the tension he could feel even if he didn't fully understand its source. Is Christmas cancelled? He asked, looking around at the tense adult faces with confusion and worry. Are we not having Christmas? The innocent question pierced through the confrontation, reminding Margaret that her grandchildren were blameless in this situation. Whatever grievances she harbored toward her children, whatever boundaries she needed to establish, the little ones deserved a joyful holiday experience. No, sweetheart, Margaret answered gently, her voice softening as she addressed Noah. We're not cancelling Christmas. We're just deciding what kind of Christmas we're going to have and making sure everyone understands the rules for being together." Christine moved to guide Noah back toward the kitchen, but Margaret raised her hand to stop her. "Let him stay. In fact, let's have all the children join us. They should understand what's happening and why. They're part of this family too, and they deserve honesty." After the remaining grandchildren were gathered, ranging from 6-year-old Emma to 15-year-old Sophie, Margaret addressed them directly, speaking to them with the respect she wished their parents had shown her. "I love all of you very much," Margaret began, making eye contact with each young face. "And I've missed you terribly during all the holidays we haven't shared together. Your parents and I are having a grown-up discussion about how we can be a better family going forward. One where everyone feels included and respected, where people communicate honestly instead of making assumptions." Noah frowned thoughtfully, his expression serious. "Like when you tell us to use our words instead of just taking toys from each other, to ask permission." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the adults, the simple childhood parallel cutting straight to the heart of the matter with devastating accuracy. "Exactly like that," Margaret agreed, unable to suppress a small smile at his insight. "Sometimes even grown-ups need reminders about sharing, asking permission, and considering others' feelings." Robert set down the agreement document, his expression conflicted, the warring impulses of pride and recognition visible on his face. "Mum, can we have a moment to discuss this privately?" "Just the three of us siblings." Margaret nodded, gesturing toward the study. "Take all the time you need. The study is through that door." As her 3 children filed out to confer, Margaret turned her attention to her grandchildren, asking about school, their activities, their interests, making up for lost time in small but meaningful ways. David discreetly stepped outside to give them privacy, while William moved to the kitchen to prepare coffee, understanding that Margaret needed this moment with her grandchildren without additional adult supervision. 15 minutes later, Robert, Jennifer, and Thomas returned. Something in their demeanor had shifted significantly. The defensive posturing had been replaced by a newfound sobriety, perhaps the first genuine self-reflection they had engaged in regarding their treatment of their mother. "We've talked it through," Robert said, assuming his familiar role as spokesperson for the siblings. "And we owe you an apology. A real one, not the perfunctory kind we might have offered before." He took a deep breath, and Margaret saw something in his expression that reminded her painfully of the boy he had been before ambition and status consciousness had hardened him. "After Dad died, it was easier for us to build our holidays around our children's needs and our social obligations than to consider how lonely you might be. We told ourselves you were fine, that you understood, that it was just how things worked out each year. But the truth is, we took the easy path. We avoided the discomfort of acknowledging Dad's absence, and in doing so, we abandoned you to face that absence alone." Jennifer stepped forward, tears now flowing freely down her face, her composure completely abandoned. "The truth is, I didn't want to face holidays without Dad. Being with you reminded me so intensely that he was gone, and it was easier to just create distance, to build new traditions that didn't include those painful reminders. I never considered how much worse that made everything for you, how much more alone you must have felt." Thomas added, his voice thick with emotion, "And when we discovered you had this beautiful lakefront home, when we realized you had financial resources we knew nothing about, we were shocked, confused, and, yes, completely opportunistic. Instead of being happy that you'd found a new chapter, that you were rebuilding your life, we immediately thought about how it could benefit us, how we could use it for our convenience." Robert picked up the agreement document again, holding it with something approaching reverence rather than resentment. "We'll sign this, Mom." Not because we need a legal document to behave like decent human beings, but as a symbol of our commitment to do better, to be better, to actually consider your needs and wishes instead of just assuming you'll accommodate ours." Jennifer's voice was barely above a whisper. "And we understand completely if you want us to leave. We arrived uninvited, presumptuous, entitled. We have no right to expect you to welcome us after everything we've done, after all the years of excluding you." Margaret looked at her children, really looked at them, seeing beyond her accumulated hurt to the flawed, complicated adults they had become. In their faces, she could still see traces of Richard, traces of herself, remnants of the babies she had once held and the teenagers she had guided through difficult years. Imperfect people who had made deeply selfish choices, yes, but still her children, still capable of growth and change if given the opportunity and held to genuine accountability. "I don't want you to leave," Margaret said finally, her voice steady. "But I do want you to understand something fundamental. This is my home, my life, built entirely on my terms. You are welcome here when invited, when respectful of boundaries, when genuinely interested in me as a complete person rather than just what I can provide for you." She gestured toward the dining table with its elegant settings for three, the fine china gleaming in the afternoon light. "I had plans for tonight. Dinner with William and David, two people who have shown me more consideration and genuine friendship in recent weeks than my own children have demonstrated in years. Those plans will proceed as scheduled." Taking a deep breath, Margaret continued, "However, there's an excellent lodge in town with last-minute accommodations available. I suggest you all get settled there tonight. Take time to think about what genuine respect and inclusion actually mean. Then tomorrow, Christmas Day, you're welcome to return here as invited guests rather than presumptuous intruders. We'll have a proper holiday meal, exchange gifts, and begin the genuine process of rebuilding what's been broken over these years." A mixture of relief and chastened understanding passed across their faces as they realized Margaret was offering them a path forward, not unconditional forgiveness that would allow them to continue their entitled behavior, but an opportunity to earn back their place in her life through changed actions rather than empty promises. "That sounds more than fair," Robert said quietly, his voice carrying genuine humility for perhaps the first time Margaret could remember. "More than we deserve, honestly." As they gathered their belongings and prepared to depart for the lodge, Sophie approached Margaret hesitantly. "Grandma, would it be okay if I stayed here with you tonight? I'd really like to help with Christmas preparations and just spend time with you." Her request, so genuine and untainted by the adult complications surrounding them, touched Margaret deeply. The recognition that at least one member of the younger generation wanted connection for its own sake, rather than convenience or material benefit, meant more than Margaret could easily express. "I'd like that very much," Margaret replied, embracing Sophie for the first time in far too long, feeling the girl's arms wrap around her with desperate affection. "If your parents approve." Jennifer, overhearing the exchange, seemed about to object reflexively, but stopped herself, visibly reconsidering her automatic response. "That would be fine," she said after a moment of genuine consideration, "if that's what you both want." After the caravan of vehicles had departed for the lodge, an extraordinary silence settled over the house. David excused himself to change out of his uniform, promising to return for dinner as originally planned. William opened the bottle of champagne he had brought, pouring 3 glasses, one for himself, one for Margaret, and one for Sophie, which Margaret promptly replaced with sparkling cider, despite Sophie's protests that 15 was practically adult in European countries. "Well," William said, raising his glass with a slight smile, "that went rather differently than I expected." "Did it?" Margaret took a thoughtful sip, the bubbles sharp and celebratory on her tongue. They reacted exactly as they always have, with surprise that I might have needs and boundaries of my own. The difference is that this time there were consequences for that surprise. But they signed the agreement, Sophie pointed out, clearly still processing the afternoon's events, trying to understand the complex adult dynamics she had witnessed. That's something significant, isn't it? It's a beginning, Margaret acknowledged carefully. Actions will matter far more than signatures. We'll see over time whether they're capable of sustained change or whether this was simply a momentary recognition forced by circumstances. As David returned in civilian clothes and they settled in for their originally planned dinner, Sophie watched the three adults with curious eyes. The elegant table, the sophisticated menu, the easy conversation flowing between them. It was clearly not the grandmother Sophie thought she knew, not the peripheral family figure she had been led to expect. "You're different here," Sophie observed as Margaret served the beef Wellington with expert precision. "More, I don't know. Fully yourself, I guess." "That's remarkably perceptive," Margaret smiled at her granddaughter, pleased by the observation. "For a long time after your grandfather died, I defined myself almost entirely by my relationships to other people. Richard's widow, your parents' mother, your grandmother. This place represents the first major decision I've made purely for myself in decades, without considering anyone else's needs or expectations." "Why didn't you tell anyone about buying it?" Sophie asked. "About having the money to do it, I mean?" Margaret considered her granddaughter's question carefully, wanting to give an honest answer that Sophie could understand. "I needed space to rediscover who I am when I'm not performing assigned roles for other people. Your parents and uncle have had very specific expectations about who Mom should be. Grateful for whatever attention they chose to give, accommodating of their plans and preferences, never demanding or assertive about my own needs." David nodded, understanding from his own experience of reinvention after injury. Reinvention requires distance sometimes, space to hear your own voice without it being immediately dismissed or overridden by others' expectations. "Exactly," Margaret agreed warmly. "I needed to hear my own voice again, to understand what I actually wanted rather than what others expected me to want." Sophie twisted her napkin thoughtfully, processing this information. "Mum always talks about you like you're fragile, like you couldn't handle change or complexity or modern life, but you're not like that at all. You're actually really strong and capable." That perception served their narrative, William observed with the directness of long friendship. If Margaret was too fragile to handle complicated family gatherings or too set in her ways to enjoy their modern celebrations, they could exclude her without experiencing guilt about that exclusion. "That's kind of harsh," Sophie protested, though her expression suggested she recognized the truth in his words, uncomfortable as that recognition might be. "But accurate," Margaret said gently. "It's not a pleasant realization, I know. But part of growing up is recognizing that parents are flawed, complicated humans, rather than the perfect authorities we imagine in childhood. Your mother made choices that prioritized her comfort over my inclusion, and she constructed justifications for those choices that allowed her to avoid confronting their selfishness. Their dinner stretched into a long evening of honest conversation that ranged far beyond the day's confrontation. Sophie asked questions about Richard, about Margaret's life before marriage and children, about her teaching career and research, subjects her parents had rarely explored with genuine interest. Margaret found herself speaking more freely than she had in years, no longer measuring her words against potential judgment or dismissal, no longer performing the role of pleasant but peripheral grandmother. When Sophie finally yawned around 11 o'clock, exhaustion catching up with the emotional intensity of the day, Margaret showed her to one of the guest rooms, the room with the best view of the lake, decorated in soft blues and greys that seemed to glow in the moonlight streaming through the large windows. This would have been Mom and Dad's room, wouldn't it? Sophie asked, taking in the elegant furnishings with something approaching awe. If they'd been invited to stay... Your mother has always preferred blue tones, Margaret confirmed, but this is your room tonight. I'm glad they're not here tonight, Sophie confessed quietly, her teenage bravado dropping to reveal genuine feeling. It's nice having you entirely to myself for once. Like you're a real person instead of just this grandmother figure we see occasionally. After Sophie had settled in for the night, Margaret rejoined William and David in the living room, where they sat nursing nightcaps by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows across the contemporary furniture. She's a remarkable young woman, William observed warmly. More insightful than her mother was at that age, more willing to look at uncomfortable truths honestly. She reminds me of you, David added with a warm smile. Clear-eyed about people's motivations, unwilling to accept comfortable lies. I was never that perceptive at 15, Margaret laughed, accepting the small glass of brandy William offered her. But I hope Sophie maintains that clarity as she grows older. It will serve her well, even when the truth is uncomfortable. What about tomorrow? David asked, returning to practical matters as he often did. Are you genuinely ready for the full family presence? After today's confrontation? Margaret considered this carefully, watching the firelight dance across the ceiling, listening to the wind create small whistling sounds around the windows. I think so. Today wasn't about punishing them or establishing permanent estrangement. It was about making absolutely clear that I'm not a supporting character in their lives, not a convenient resource to be accessed when useful. I have agency, boundaries, and expectations of my own. They needed that wake-up call, William agreed firmly, though I suspect old habits will reassert themselves if you're not vigilant. Change is difficult, and people tend to revert to familiar patterns under stress. Probably, Margaret acknowledged, but I'm not the same person they could dismiss so easily anymore. This place, she gestured around the room that represented her independence and self-assertion, isn't just a house. It's a statement about who I am now and how I expect to be treated going forward. They can adapt to that reality, or they can maintain their distance, but I won't return to being the accommodating, grateful, peripheral figure they've grown comfortable ignoring. After William and David had departed with promises to check in the next day, Margaret found herself alone in her lakeside sanctuary, reflecting on the day's confrontation and its surprising resolution. Everything had changed in ways she could not have predicted when she first discovered her children's planned invasion of her home. She slept deeply that night, waking Christmas morning to find Sophie already in the kitchen, attempting to make Belgian waffles using a recipe she had found on her phone, flour dusting her cheek and confusion evident on her face as she struggled with the waffle iron. I wanted to surprise you with breakfast, Sophie explained sheepishly, gesturing at the slightly chaotic kitchen scene, but I think I misunderstood how waffle irons work. Or maybe I messed up the batter proportions. Together, they salvaged the breakfast attempt, laughing at the mishaps and enjoying the imperfect but heartfelt effort. As they ate at the kitchen island, Sophie asked hesitantly, "Do you think today will be weird? After everything that happened yesterday?" "Probably," Margaret admitted honestly. "Genuine growth usually involves some discomfort. People don't change deeply held patterns without experiencing awkwardness and uncertainty." "Are you still angry at them?" Margaret considered this carefully, wanting to give Sophie an honest answer. "Not angry, exactly. Disappointed by years of exclusion and entitlement, yes, but also cautiously hopeful that yesterday might have initiated something better, Real change is possible, but it requires sustained effort, not just momentary recognition. By noon, her children began arriving from the lodge, their approach markedly more tentative this time. They knocked respectfully and waited to be invited in, rather than attempting to simply walk into her home. They brought their overnight bags, but left them in their vehicles until explicitly welcomed to stay. Small changes that signaled they had absorbed at least some of yesterday's lessons. Robert presented Margaret with a beautifully wrapped package, his expression uncertain. "We got you something special," he explained carefully. "Before everything. Before we knew about the house and everything. It seems inadequate now, given everything, but we hope you'll like it." Inside the elegant wrapping was a professionally assembled photo album, bound in leather with Margaret's initials embossed in gold. The pages contained photographs spanning decades, from her wedding to Richard, through the births of grandchildren and various family milestones. Many of the photos Margaret had never seen before, images from her children's phones and computers that she had been excluded from as they built their digital archives. "We realized you might not have copies of many of these," Jennifer explained, her voice tentative, "especially the recent ones of the grandkids. We wanted you to have them, to have this record of everything you've missed being part of." The thoughtfulness of the gift, albeit late and prompted by crisis, touched Margaret genuinely. "Thank you. This means a great deal to me, more than you probably understand." As the day progressed, a curious transformation unfolded in the household dynamics. Without the presumption of control or ownership, her children seemed genuinely unsure how to behave in Margaret's home. They asked permission before using the kitchen. They consulted her about activities and timing. They generally exhibited a cautiousness that, while slightly awkward, represented a meaningful shift in the fundamental power dynamic. Thomas, helping Margaret prepare vegetables for Christmas dinner later in the afternoon, broke through the careful politeness with unexpected candor. "I didn't realize how beautiful it is here," he said quietly, focusing on the carrots he was chopping with careful precision. "I can see why you chose this place specifically. It speaks to something essential." "It does speak to me," Margaret agreed, working beside him at the expansive kitchen island. "The lake has a permanence that's deeply comforting somehow. The seasons change, but the fundamental landscape endures." "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Thomas continued, still keeping his eyes on his task rather than meeting her gaze directly, "about being treated as an afterthought. You're right, we've been selfish. After Dad died, it was easier to create distance than to face holidays with his empty chair at the table, to acknowledge the absence." "I understand that impulse," Margaret replied, her voice gentle but firm. "I felt his absence more acutely than anyone, but pushing me away only compounded the loss. You lost your father, but I lost my partner of nearly 40 years, and then I effectively lost my children too, when you all chose distance over connection." Thomas nodded, his eyes suspiciously bright with unshed tears. "I know that now. I understand it in a way I didn't let myself see before. We should have drawn closer together after Dad died, supported each other through grief. Instead, we drifted apart, and I'm genuinely sorry for my part in that." Similar moments of reflection occurred throughout the day, small but genuine, not dramatic apologies or complete transformations, but incremental acknowledgements of wrongdoing and tentative steps toward reconnection. By evening, as they gathered around the Christmas dinner Margaret had prepared with some help from her children, the atmosphere had evolved from strained politeness to something more authentically warm. Not perfect, certainly not instantly healed, but moving in a direction that felt, for the first time in 6 years, like genuine family connection. Margaret had set the dining table with care, but not with the same pointed exclusivity as the previous evening. Now there were places for everyone, the fine china mixed with more casual pieces to accommodate the larger group. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight, and the centerpiece of fresh evergreens and winter berries created a festive but elegant atmosphere. "Mum, this is beautiful," Jennifer said with genuine appreciation as she took her assigned seat. "Really beautiful. I don't think I've ever seen such an elegantly set table in a family setting." "Your father gave me that china for our 35th anniversary," Margaret explained, carefully placing the last serving dish on the table. "I never used it in the old house because there never seemed to be an appropriate occasion. I've realized recently that beautiful things shouldn't be saved indefinitely for some day. They should be enjoyed in the present." "Why not before?" Noah asked, with characteristic childhood directness. "Why didn't you use pretty plates before?" Margaret considered her answer carefully, aware that all the grandchildren were listening. "I suppose I had internalized the idea that beautiful things should be reserved for special occasions, for perfect moments. But that meant they just sat unused in cabinets, never bringing joy to anyone. I've learned that every day can be special if you choose to treat it that way." Robert raised his glass, his expression more serious than his usual performative cheer. "May I propose a toast?" When everyone had raised their glasses, he continued, "To new beginnings, to honest communication, and to not taking for granted the people who matter most." There was a moment of collective consideration as his words registered. Then glasses clinked in response. Christine, surprisingly, was the first to add to the toast. "To family," she said softly, "in all its complicated, imperfect, messy reality. May we do better going forward." As they enjoyed the meal, Margaret had prepared, more sophisticated than the traditional roast turkey her children had probably expected. Conversation flowed with surprising ease. The children, included in adult conversation, rather than relegated to their own isolated world, rose to the occasion with better manners and more thoughtful contributions than their parents had likely anticipated. Noah, seated between Robert and Christine, turned to Margaret with genuine curiosity between courses. "Nana Maggie, where did you learn to cook like this? This is fancy, like restaurant food." "I took cooking classes in the city last year," Margaret explained, pleased by his interest. "French cuisine, primarily. I've always enjoyed cooking, but after your grandfather died, I wanted to expand my skills beyond the family meals I'd been making for decades." "You never mentioned cooking classes," Jennifer said, a note of something that might have been defensiveness or possibly genuine hurt creeping into her tone. "You never asked about my activities or interests," Margaret replied mildly, without accusation but with clarity. "After your father died, I developed several new interests and skills. The cooking classes were just one aspect. I also took watercolor painting workshops, attended investment seminars to better understand managing my own finances, even tried my hand at learning Italian for a trip I was planning." Thomas looked genuinely surprised, his assumptions visibly shifting. "I had no idea you were interested in investments or languages, or painting for that matter." "There's quite a bit you don't know about me," Margaret acknowledged without rancor or judgment. "I've changed substantially in the past 6 years. I've grown and developed in ways that might surprise you if you took the time to ask and genuinely listen." "I'm starting to see that," Thomas admitted, something like genuine remorse coloring his voice. "And I regret that I haven't been paying attention to who you've become." As dinner progressed, Margaret observed her family with fresh clarity. Without the weight of her expectations for inclusion, or their expectations that she conform to their outdated image of her, they were discovering each other anew. Her children asked questions about her life they had never bothered to pose before. The grandchildren, witnessing this more authentic interaction between the adults, joined in with their own curiosities about their grandmother's interests and experiences. After dinner, they moved to the living room for coffee and dessert. Margaret had prepared individual chocolate soufflés, another skill from her cooking classes, which elicited appreciative murmurs from everyone as she served them still warm from the oven. "This is different from our usual Christmas," Jennifer observed, curling into an armchair with her soufflé, her expression thoughtful, more intentional somehow, more present. Because it's Grandma's Christmas on Grandma's terms, not just a copy of everyone else's celebration, Sophie said wisely from her spot on the floor near the fire, earning an appreciative nod from Margaret. Christine studied Margaret over her coffee cup, her expression complex. I feel like we're meeting a different person than the mother-in-law I've known for nearly 20 years. Not different, Margaret corrected gently but firmly. Just more complete. For years I allowed myself to be defined primarily by my roles in your lives. Mother, grandmother, widow. This past year, I've been actively reclaiming the other aspects of who I am beyond those relational roles. As evening deepened and shadows lengthened across the snow-covered landscape outside, the younger children grew tired from the day's excitement. Robert checked his watch, then looked at Margaret with genuine uncertainty, replacing his usual assumption of welcome. We should probably head back to the lodge soon. The little ones need their regular bedtime routines. Margaret nodded, noting his careful phrasing, not presuming they would stay in her home as they had originally planned. Of course. Though you're welcome to return tomorrow for breakfast if you'd like. We could make it a tradition, perhaps. Boxing Day breakfast, if you're interested. Really? Jennifer looked surprised at the invitation, perhaps not expecting Margaret to extend additional time together after everything that had transpired. Yes, Margaret said simply. Today has been healing in many unexpected ways. I'd like to continue building on what we've started here. As they gathered their things, collecting scattered wrapping paper and the grandchildren's new toys, the mood was markedly different from their entitled arrival the previous day. Each family member thanked Margaret individually with varying degrees of sincerity and self-awareness, but all acknowledging that the day had unfolded in ways they had not anticipated or planned. Sophie hung back as the others headed toward their cars, approaching Margaret with obvious reluctance to leave. Would it be okay if I stayed again tonight? I'd like to help with breakfast tomorrow if you're serious about that. Her request touched Margaret deeply, this desire for continued connection beyond the required family obligation. I'd like that very much, if your parents approve. Jennifer, overhearing the exchange, seemed about to raise objections reflexively, but stopped herself with visible effort. She looked at Sophie, then at Margaret, then back at her daughter. That would be fine, she said after a moment of genuine consideration. If that's what you both want. Sophie, please be helpful and respectful. I will, Mom, Sophie promised, her relief evident. After the others had all departed, their taillights disappearing down the snowy road toward town, Sophie helped Margaret with the dishes, moving around the kitchen with growing familiarity born of 2 nights in the house. You know what I realized today, Sophie said, carefully drying a crystal wine glass. I've never really known you, like the real you as a complete person. What do you mean? Margaret asked, scrubbing a serving dish. At home, when we've visited before, you're always just Grandma, this person who exists in the background, who sends birthday cards and listens to Mom complain about work and nods along with whatever we're saying. But here, you're Margaret, this whole interesting, complex person with opinions and talents and interests I never knew existed. Her insight struck Margaret profoundly, this recognition from a 15-year-old of something her own children still struggled to fully grasp. That's very perceptive, Sophie. Is that why you bought this place? Sophie pressed, genuine curiosity in her voice. To be Margaret instead of just Grandma. Partly, Margaret acknowledged, considering her answer carefully, though the two aren't mutually exclusive. Being your grandmother is one of my greatest joys. I just needed space to be all the other parts of myself too, to remember that I'm a person beyond my relationships to other people. Later, as they sat by the fire with mugs of hot chocolate, Sophie asked tentatively, Do you think they'll go back to how they were before? Once Christmas is over and everything goes back to normal. Margaret considered her granddaughter's question carefully, not wanting to be either naively optimistic or unnecessarily cynical. "Oh, patterns are powerful things, Sophie. I suspect there will be backsliding and moments of forgetfulness, but I've fundamentally changed the equation by establishing clear boundaries and expectations. And I won't return to being the accommodating, grateful figure I was before, waiting hopefully for whatever attention they might spare." "And this house makes it real," Sophie observed, looking around the space that so clearly expressed Margaret's independent identity. "They can't pretend anymore that you're just sitting around waiting for their attention or living some diminished life." "Exactly," Margaret smiled, impressed by her granddaughter's insight. "This house is both sanctuary and statement. It's proof that I've moved forward, that I'm building a life I find fulfilling, with or without their inclusion." "I want to visit you here," Sophie said suddenly, her words rushing out as if she feared losing courage. "Not just with my parents or for holidays, just to spend time with you, to get to know you better. Would that be okay?" "More than okay," Margaret assured her, profoundly moved by the request. "This home was meant for living fully, not in isolation. You're welcome here any time, Sophie. Truly." As they prepared for bed, Sophie paused at her bedroom door, looking back at Margaret. "This has been the best Christmas I can remember," she said thoughtfully. "Not because of presents or anything material, but because it felt real. Honest." "Real is a good word for it," Margaret agreed warmly. "Authentic might be another. No performances, no roles, just people trying to connect honestly." After Sophie had gone to her room, Margaret stood at the great windows, watching moonlight glitter across the frozen lake's surface. The world outside transformed into shades of silver and blue. The house around her house, chosen entirely for her own pleasure, felt different tonight. No longer just a statement of independence or a refuge from exclusion, but the beginning of something genuinely new. A place where authentic family connections might finally have room to grow without the constraints of old patterns and expectations. Spring came to the lake with gradual persistence, melting the ice into open water and coaxing pale green buds from dormant branches. Margaret had been in her lakeside home for nearly 5 months now, watching the seasons transform the landscape from pristine winter white to the vibrant awakening of spring. Much like the land around her, her relationships with her children had undergone their own thaw, gradual, sometimes halting and uneven, but undeniably progressing toward something healthier. The changes had not happened overnight, or in a smooth progression. January brought tentative phone calls, carefully calibrated in tone and duration, as if her children were learning a new language of respect. February saw Margaret's first invitations to their homes, genuine invitations with reasonable advance notice, not last-minute obligations or afterthoughts designed to ease their guilt. March introduced a new pattern of Sunday video calls with the grandchildren, scheduled weekly rather than occurring sporadically when parental guilt prompted connection. Small changes that accumulated over months represented significant shifts in the fundamental family dynamic. Not transformation, perhaps, but definite movement toward mutual respect and authentic connection. On this particular April morning, Margaret stood on her deck with coffee, surveying the property she had come to love with surprising intensity. The air carried the scent of pine and new growth, invigorating and peaceful simultaneously. Her phone chimed with a text from Sophie, who had become her most consistent correspondent since Christmas. "Finished my college application essay. Can I email it to you for feedback? It's about finding your voice and choosing independence, inspired by someone I know and admire." Margaret smiled, typing back her enthusiastic agreement. Sophie's transformation over the past months had been particularly rewarding to witness. From a somewhat self-absorbed teenager to a thoughtful young woman developing her own value system, often distinct from her parents' materialistic priorities and social ambitions. The sound of tires on gravel drew Margaret's attention to the driveway, where David's truck appeared around the bend. Since Christmas, their friendship had deepened into something neither of them had anticipated when they first met, a companionship that brought richness to both their lives. Not romance exactly, though perhaps edging in that direction with patient deliberation. They were both cautious people who valued clarity and intention in relationships. "Morning," David called, emerging from the vehicle with a bakery box in one hand and gardening tools in the other. "Ready to tackle those raised beds we discussed?" They had planned to create a vegetable garden on the sunny southern exposure of the property. Margaret's first attempt at growing food rather than just ornamental plants. David, with his practical knowledge of the area's growing conditions and his own experience with mountain gardening, had offered to help design and build the raised beds. "Absolutely," Margaret replied, meeting him at the bottom of the deck stairs, "though I'm not entirely convinced I have any natural talent for gardening." "Talent is overrated," David said, handing her the bakery box with a warm smile. "Persistence and attention matter far more. Plants respond to consistent care, not natural aptitude." "Rather like relationships," Margaret observed, accepting the pastries with a grateful smile. "Exactly like relationships," David agreed, his eyes crinkling at the corners with genuine affection. They spent the morning measuring and constructing the cedar frames that would hold Margaret's first serious gardening endeavor. The physical work was satisfying in ways her previous life had rarely offered, creating something tangible, useful, and potentially nourishing, something that would grow and change with care and attention. "Your son called me yesterday," David mentioned casually as they broke for lunch on the deck, the spring sun warm on their faces. Margaret paused in surprise, setting down her sandwich. "Robert?" "Whatever for?" "He wanted to know if I'd be here this weekend. Said he didn't want to interrupt or assume if we had plans." David's slight smile suggested he recognized the significance of this consideration, the thoughtfulness implicit in the question, so different from the entitled assumptions of Christmas, warmed Margaret unexpectedly. "What did you tell him?" "That he should talk to you directly about your availability," David replied. "Not assume I keep your calendar or control your time." "Wise answer," Margaret said approvingly. "He's trying, Margaret." "They all are, in their various imperfect ways," David observed gently. "They are," Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "Imperfectly, inconsistently, but more genuinely than before. It's more than I expected, honestly. You changed the fundamental equation," David pointed out. "Made them see you as a complete person with agency and boundaries, not just a convenient maternal figure to be accessed when needed and ignored when not." Before Margaret could respond, her phone rang. Robert's name appeared on the screen, as if their conversation about him had summoned him. "Mom!" Robert greeted her when she answered, his voice carrying none of the forced patience that used to irritate her so deeply. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything?" "Not at all. David and I are just having lunch after building some garden beds for vegetables." A brief pause, perhaps as Robert processed this domestic image. "That's actually related to why I'm calling. Christine and I were wondering if we could bring the kids up this weekend. Noah has been asking about your lake house constantly for weeks, and we thought a proper visit might be nice. If you're available and willing, of course." The careful phrasing, a request rather than an assumption of welcome, was not lost on Margaret. Progress, genuine progress. "That would be lovely, Robert. When were you thinking of arriving?" "Saturday morning, if that works for your schedule. We'd get rooms at that lodge in town, of course. We wouldn't presume to stay without an explicit invitation. Another meaningful difference from Christmas, this careful respect for her space and autonomy." The lodge is lovely, but you're genuinely welcome to use the guest rooms if you prefer. Just let me know your decision so I can prepare accordingly." After finalizing the details and ending the call, Margaret looked up to find David watching her with quiet approval, his expression suggesting satisfaction at witnessing the changed dynamic. "That sounded promisingly respectful," he observed. "It was," Margaret agreed, somewhat surprised herself by the shift. "Though I'm still adjusting to this new version of Robert who actually asks rather than informs or assumes." "Do you trust it will last?" David asked, the question carrying genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. Margaret considered this carefully, watching a pair of ducks land on the lake's surface with small splashes. "I trust that the dynamic has fundamentally shifted. Whether every interaction will perfectly reflect that change is another matter entirely. Old habits will resurface occasionally, human nature being what it is. But the baseline has moved. The expectations are different now." "Because you shifted first," David pointed out. "You stopped accepting the role they had assigned you and insisted on being seen as a complete person." Later that afternoon, after David had left with promises to return the next day to continue the garden project, William called for their weekly conversation that had continued faithfully since Christmas. Margaret brought him up to date on the garden project and Robert's upcoming visit, the ongoing evolution of her relationships with her children. "Sounds like the progress continues steadily," William noted approvingly. "How are you feeling about all of it?" "About where things stand now?" Margaret glanced around at her home, so thoroughly hers in every detail, from the art on the walls, to the books on the shelves, to the garden beds taking shape outside. "Content," she replied truthfully. "Not because everything is perfect with my children. It's not, and probably never will be. But because my happiness and sense of self-worth no longer depend on their approval or consistent inclusion." "That's the real victory," William observed with the wisdom of long friendship. "Independence of spirit, not just living situation. You've reclaimed yourself." That evening, as twilight settled over the lake and the first stars became visible in the darkening sky, Margaret walked the perimeter of her property, mentally mapping where she might plant flowering shrubs to attract butterflies and hummingbirds, where a bench might offer the perfect spot for morning meditation, where wind chimes would catch the afternoon breezes, small additions to make this place even more distinctly hers, even more fully reflective of her tastes and desires. Her phone chimed with an email from Sophie containing her college essay, accompanied by a nervous message asking for Margaret's honest opinion and detailed feedback. Margaret settled into her favorite chair by the window to read it, touched that Sophie valued her perspective so highly that she trusted Margaret's judgment and wisdom. The essay was beautifully written, exploring how witnessing Margaret's transformation had inspired Sophie's own reconsideration of priorities and authentic self-expression. She wrote of Christmas Eve, the night she had stayed behind when the others went to the lodge, as a turning point in her understanding of what it meant to live intentionally rather than according to others' expectations. "In watching my grandmother reclaim her identity beyond the roles assigned to her," Sophie had written, "I began to question which parts of my own identity were authentic and which were performances designed to secure approval." Her courage in establishing boundaries, even when painful and even with family, showed me that genuine relationships must be built on mutual respect rather than obligation or convenience. She taught me that choosing yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary for building a life of integrity and meaning. Tears welled unexpectedly as Margaret read her granddaughter's words, the emotion catching her by surprise. Of all the outcomes she had imagined when she purchased this lakeside sanctuary, peace, independence, self-discovery, she had never anticipated becoming a model of empowerment for her teenage granddaughter, inspiring Sophie to question and challenge the assumptions that had constrained them both. The realization crystallized something Margaret had been feeling increasingly over the past months. This home, initially acquired as a reaction to exclusion, a statement of independence born from hurt and anger, had evolved into something far more positive and generative. Not a retreat from painful relationships, but a foundation for authentic ones. Not an ending, but a genuine beginning of something better. Margaret composed a thoughtful response to Sophie, praising both her writing skills and her insights, encouraging her to trust her own judgment and voice. Then she stepped onto the deck to watch the last light fade from the sky, the first stars appearing like promises above the dark silhouette of the mountains. 6 months ago, she had stood in almost this same spot, nursing wounds of exclusion and steeling herself for confrontation, uncertain of her future. Now she stood in quiet anticipation of Saturday's family visit, not desperate for their approval, not anxious about their judgment, but genuinely looking forward to continuing their collective journey toward more honest connection. The lakeside house had served its purpose, Margaret realized, not as the dramatic statement of independence she had initially imagined, but as the solid foundation for a life rebuilt entirely on her own terms, a life with room for family, for friendship, for growth, for discovery. A life where being forgotten for Christmas had led, through unexpected and sometimes painful pathways, to being truly seen and valued for the first time in years. Margaret smiled up at the emerging stars, feeling both grounded and free, like the mountains themselves, standing firm while reaching skyward, enduring while constantly changing with the seasons. She had found her way home, not to a place of isolation, but to herself, and in doing so, had opened the possibility for her family to find their way to genuine connection with her at last.